When war broke out in 1939, as Nazi tanks stormed across the Polish border, it would have been virtually impossible to predict just how far-reaching the consequences of Adolf Hitler's actions would be. By the winter of 1943, from north, south, east and west, the battle cries rang out across the globe, and the atrocities visited upon innocent civilians, particularly those of the Jewish faith, became ever more horrifically apparent. But as Hitler's Axis powers crushed and subjugated entire populations, news of Nazi and Japanese crimes against humanity served to fuel Allied determination to win the war as quickly as possible. The plight of those held in concentration camps was no longer hidden from view, and although it would still be some considerable time before surviving inmates would be liberated, there was now at least hope for some of them. What's more, as October 1943 drew to a close, a formal Allied agreement to set up a United Nations Commission on War Crimes was put in place. Those responsible for atrocities would be called upon to account for their actions, and following orders would be no defence. The months of October, November and December 1943 saw the culmination of many campaigns, and the foundations were laid for many more. Events in the Pacific were rapidly gathering momentum, 2 years on from the surprise Japanese attack on the American naval fleet at Pearl Harbor. Without doubt, the devastating efficiency of Japan's air force makes this one of the most well-known offensives of the entire Second World War. But through the course of this programme, you'll discover that there were also many less well-known skirmishes in the Pacific that were equally fascinating. As well as considering these events in the Pacific, we'll also be focusing on the Allied campaign in Italy, following on from victory over Hitler's troops in North Africa. And all the while, the conflict in Russia was becoming ever more significant, particularly as alliances shifted in the build-up to the Cairo and Tehran conferences, as the blueprint for the Allies' endgame took shape. So, beginning on October the 1st, 1943, our journey tracking the countdown to victory takes us to Italy, when Allied forces entered the harbour city of Naples. The complex politics of Italy and the nation's position in World War II meant that the people of Naples had already risen up against the German army of occupation before the Allies arrived. However, to really get a true understanding of the events in Italy in 1943, we really do need to backtrack to the end of the First World War. Just as Adolf Hitler rose to prominence in Germany in the aftermath of World War I, in Italy, Benito Mussolini followed a very similar route to power. Born in 1883, the son of a blacksmith, Mussolini moved to Switzerland in 1902 in search of work, and it was here that he became involved in socialist politics. When he returned to Italy in 1904, it was to become a journalist with a socialist publication, but he broke away from the socialists when they opposed Italy's entry into World War I, and when he was drafted in 1915, Mussolini took up arms for his country. In all, Mussolini saw about 9 months active service, and in the years after the war, he returned to the political arena, this time not as a socialist, but by forming the Fascist Party early in 1919. Like Adolf Hitler in Germany, Mussolini believed he would be his nation's saviour. Where discontent was rife, he found his supporters. Many unemployed war veterans followed where Mussolini led, and were organised into squads of black shirts who terrorised their political opponents. It was the beginning of a dark age of oppression for the Italian people, And when the fascists were invited to join a coalition government in 1921, things went from bad to worse when the black shirts marched on Rome. Even the King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, turned to Mussolini, inviting the self-styled Il Duce to form a government with disastrous consequences, as by 1925 democracy had been dismantled. Italy found itself in the grip of a dictator every bit as unpredictable as Adolf Hitler was becoming in Germany. After the Wall Street crash of 1929 saw the world fall into an economic depression, the 1930s found both Hitler and Mussolini empire building at an alarming rate. In Mussolini's case, Abyssinia, today better known as Ethiopia, was the main target. As well as gaining inroads into Africa, Mussolini also supported General Franco in the Spanish Civil War, and more importantly, cooperated with Hitler and Nazi Germany to such a degree that it culminated in May 1939 in their Pact of Steel as World War II loomed large. Italy formally entered World War II on the 10th of June 1940, officially signing up to the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Japan on the 27th of September of that same year. Under Mussolini's leadership, however, Italy was far from being a strong military nation, and as early as 1941 had suffered multiple defeats in Greece and at the hands of the British in North Africa. Ironically, without German intervention, Mussolini and the Italian army would have faced a catastrophic military collapse, and for the people of Italy, confidence in Il Duce was shaken, if not stirred. Despite Mussolini's pre-World War II activity in Africa, the Italians were defeated in the desert, along with the Germans under the command of Erwin Rommel, Hitler's appropriately named Desert Fox. And naturally, once soldiers of the calibre of the British General Bernard Montgomery had secured North Africa, the Allies looked towards Italy as the next logical stepping stone back into mainland Europe. The Allies' successful campaign to take Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, began in July and came as quite a shock to the Italians. Their position was horribly precarious. Not only did they have the battle-hardened British, Canadian and American troops from North Africa to worry about, but their so-called allies, the Nazis, were equally menacing. If the Italians surrendered, they would come under immediate German attack, and anger against Mussolini for putting Italy in such a predicament grew. With Sicily under heavy attack, early in July 1943, Mussolini was removed from power and put under arrest. The King of Italy himself took control, and with Marshal Badoglio taking charge of the government, Hitler feared an imminent Italian surrender to the Allies and ordered plans be put in place immediately to liberate Mussolini. Having been humiliated on the Eastern Front with the loss of Stalingrad, Hitler was determined that the dramatic turn of events in Italy and all around the Mediterranean would not be permitted to undermine his power even further. Consequently, when the Italians did surrender unconditionally to the Allies early in September, the Germans were swift to react. Firstly, they liberated Mussolini and restored him as a puppet dictator. Then they set to work, salvaging whatever they could as they attempted to halt the Allies in their tracks. What was about to unfold in Italy would change the course of the war, and the American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, astutely commented in one of his famous fireside chat broadcasts that the first crack in the Axis has come. The criminal, corrupt fascist regime in Italy is going to pieces. The question now was who would pick up the fallen pieces first, the Allies or the Germans? In the last days of September 1943, the Allies were making good progress in the south of Italy. While the King and Marshal Badoglio met the American general Dwight D. Eisenhower aboard HMS Nelson to sign a full armistice, to the north, Hitler had annexed the German-speaking regions of northern Italy. What had seemed to the Allies an easy advance to Rome was now becoming very much more complicated as the lines between who was friend and who was foe became increasingly blurred. By the 1st of October, when the Allies marched into Naples, the Germans had been fighting a revolt by the citizens of the city. Matters had exploded into conflict when German soldiers began to loot a shop. At least among the devastation of Naples, the Allies were assured of the support of their new brothers in arms. Meanwhile, on the Adriatic side of Italy, as October began, the Allies had also captured Foggia, and with it the most important airport in the region. Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, was quick to assess the situation and realised that even his considerable talents would be stretched in putting a positive spin on this event. The Allies now had the potential to launch air attacks on Nazi-held strongholds in the Balkans, as well as giving them a springboard to attack southern Germany. This was of little consolation, though, to the thousands of Italian soldiers who were now facing the full brunt of Hitler's wrath. Even those who'd surrendered to the Germans, including 5,000 on the Greek island of Cephalonia, were brutally massacred by the Nazis, and with the pressure mounting, it wasn't only military personnel that faced the backlash of German retaliation. On October the 3rd, the Gestapo ordered all the Jews in Athens to register, and Greece quickly became an important focal point for the Allies, with Italy being so close by. But the Germans were equally determined to secure as much territory in the area as possible. Within 24 hours, the British protectors of the island of Kos had been beaten soundly by Hitler's Axis powers, despite the cracks spotted in their armour by Roosevelt. And as the Greek Jews were targeted, the Italian Jews were also about to discover the sting of Nazi persecution. On October the 9th, 100 Italian Jews from Trieste were rounded up and sent to Auschwitz, and not one of them survived. This was the Day of Atonement in the Jewish calendar, the ancient festival of Yom Kippur, one of the holiest of all Jewish holidays. At Auschwitz, this day did not go unmarked, as the Nazis picked out 1,000 inmates they claimed were too weak to work and executed them. Without the protection of being part of Hitler's axis of evil, the Jews of Italy were now SS targets. There were nonetheless some advantages to be enjoyed, because Eisenhower announced that there would be no more Allied bombing raids on Italy, and all efforts were made to prevent the ships of the Italian Navy falling into German hands. But Hitler's retaliation was unrelenting, and as the Luftwaffe were ordered to attack the escaping ships as they headed for Malta, he also drafted in more ground troops from the Russian front. With the Nazis in full occupation of Rome, General Erwin Rommel was charged with commanding operations in northern Italy, while General Kesselring had the daunting task of stemming the tide of the Allied advance in the south and protecting the Italian capital. Although Kesselring could do little about Naples, the Führer would have been delighted at the devastation his general left behind for the Allies to deal with. The reprisals were appalling, as all communication, transport, water and power systems were destroyed, while the city's buildings burnt, bridges were bombed, railway tracks were torn up, and the harbour was a mass of sunken ships. The workload for the Allies was huge, and Kesselring would have been well aware that in excess of 800,000 civilians would now be reliant upon the Allies for their survival. Instead of speedily moving north to consolidate their advantage, the Allies were stalled as they dealt with the aftermath of Naples. But, to their credit, the port was restored, reopened, and functioning within a week. With the Allied commanders' sights now set on Rome, there was no time to lose, and the German defensive line at the Volturno River, 20 miles northwest of Naples, came under attack. The Volturno line ran from the town of Termoli along the Biferno River through the Apennine Mountains to the Volturno River. As early as the 6th of October, Canadian tanks had forced the German troops of occupation to withdraw from Termoli, and by the 12th of the month, the American Fifth Army had crossed the river to breach the German defensive line, and in so doing, push the Nazis back yet further. The very next day, the King and the Italian government declared war on Germany as the battles raged on. There were heavy civilian casualties as well as military losses, with what happened at places like Campobasso being typical. Resonant with ancient history, even the City Hall with all the archives was destroyed as the 1st Canadian Corps eventually took Campobasso from the Germans. By October the 16th, the Allies were just 90 miles from Rome, but on the very same day, in the capital, German SS officers seized more than 1,000 Italian Jews. However, with more than 4,000 Jews given refuge in private homes, monasteries and convents, not to mention almost 500 hidden inside the Vatican, the Nazis once again found themselves thwarted by their former allies. The Allied war effort was now really gathering pace as from the snow-clad mountains of Italy to the sweltering jungles of the Pacific, the dream that victory could be theirs was steadily becoming a reality. The positive influence of Roosevelt, Eisenhower and the Americans was making a colossal difference, and with them came propaganda every bit as effective as that manipulated by Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis.
We feel we could win the war.
Hollywood film stars rallied to entertain the troops, and from the glamorous Carol Landis to the comical Joe Brown, many entertainers were happy to play their part, no matter what the dangers to their own personal safety. And in this positive atmosphere, plans for the Allied invasion of France were also gathering momentum. In the south of England, exercises were taking place with tank landing craft, and by the middle of October, the codename Mulberry had been selected for the hugely daring artificial harbours made of concrete that would be such an essential part of the D-Day landing plan. Nevertheless, the principal Allied nations, Great Britain, the USA, and Russia, were far from feeling at ease with each other, especially as Russia had been so closely linked with Hitler in the early stages of the war. It was Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, who had speedily moved to recruit Joseph Stalin to the Allied cause after Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, when the Germans had invaded Russia. Ever since, despite Hitler's confident prediction that the Soviets would crumble before him, the Russians had been a constant thorn in his side. But Churchill, of all people, a man who in his long political life had changed his allegiances on more than one occasion, was all too aware of the disastrous consequences if Russia were to defect back to the Axis powers. Consequently, on the 18th of October in Moscow, the American, British and Russian foreign ministers agreed that they would not consider any separate peace negotiations with Germany, while the very next day in Washington, the Americans agreed to supply millions of tons of aid to the Soviets. As October 1943 drew to its conclusion, with the Allies manoeuvring into position to sustain their assault on the Axis powers, the cost in human suffering was escalating. On October the 25th, the Japanese completed the Burma-Thailand Railway with the forced labour of 46,000 Allied prisoners of war. More than 16,000 of them had died of starvation, brutality and disease, alongside many thousands more Burmese citizens caught up in a war not of their making, in which they too were forced to labour for Imperial Japan. Just as events in southern Europe were now moving at a rapid pace, the same was equally true in the Pacific. On the very first day of November, US soldiers of the 3rd Marine Division landed in Empress Augusta Bay on the Solomon Island of Bougainville. Backed up by an impressive US naval task force of 4 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, and commanded by the brilliant Rear Admiral Aaron S. Tip Merrill, the Americans quickly consolidated their position. The Japanese were equally quick to respond, launching air attacks from Rabaul, as well as dispatching their own powerful task force of cruisers and destroyers. Merrill was the first American Rear Admiral to use radar, and in this battle it gave him a major advantage. Without radar, the Japanese commander failed to assess the outcome of the battle accurately when Merrill retreated under cover of smoke. Returning to Rabaul, the Japanese believed they'd been victorious and prepared to re-attack the Allied landing forces at Bougainville without realising Merrill's task force was still very much intact. Two US aircraft carriers raided Rabaul on the 5th of November, and having underestimated their enemy, the Japanese fleet sustained heavy losses, which meant that any danger to the now well-established US Marines from Japan's Imperial Navy had for the time being at least passed. Success in the Solomon Islands had been crucial to the Allies, because it was from here that the Japanese had planned to expand into New Guinea, Papua, and most worryingly of all, Australia. To recap a little, the campaign for the Solomon Islands had started back in February 1943, with General MacArthur leading a sustained American strategic offensive. By June, islands that people had never before heard of in the West were suddenly on the map. In Operation Toenails, the Americans overcame Japanese resistance as they landed on the island of Rendova, with a crucial airfield at Munda within attack range from there. While American and Japanese ships battled for dominance in the waters of the Kula and Vela Gulfs. Although there was no outright victory for the Allies, the Japanese were prevented from backing up their ground troops. When Munda Airfield fell to the Americans on the 5th of August, Phase 1 of their campaign was complete. But there was still a great deal of work to be done, clearing Japanese troops from New Georgia and the surrounding islands of Arundel, Banga, Gizo, Kolombangara and Vella La Vella. The Japanese were a most tenacious enemy, honour-bound, never to contemplate surrender, always fighting to the death. In the build-up to the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay in November 43, Operation Toenails had been vital. What lay ahead was destined to be equally challenging. Interestingly, the Japanese suffered much heavier losses of ships and planes than the Americans. But while the USA could manufacture replacements, by this stage in the war, the Japanese could not. Nevertheless, the Japanese determination in battle and policy of no surrender continued undaunted, serving notice to the Allies that whatever the outcome of the war against Hitler in Europe, victory over the Japanese was going to be a completely separate issue. With the end of 1943 just weeks away, Adolf Hitler was finding the troops available to him were becoming ever more thinly spread. Having to occupy Italy, as well as cope with another bitter cold winter on the Russian front, was bad enough. But the Germans were now in no doubt that an invasion of Western Europe sometime in 1944 was imminent. In fact, on November the 3rd, Adolf Hitler issued Directive 51, warning of the anticipated Allied landings, and his propaganda minister Goebbels once again had a difficult task ahead of him, convincing the German nation that their Führer was still invincible. Goebbels' personal diaries offer a fascinating insight, and on the day before Hitler issued Directive 51, Goebbels made an entry regarding the fact that more than 9,000 German soldiers had been killed on the Eastern Front in just 9 days. He said, "We cannot sustain such a drain for long. We are in danger of slowly bleeding to death in the East." Whatever the public face of Nazi propaganda, Goebbels, like many of his fellow high-ranking officials, was fully aware of the all-too-real danger of Germany being defeated. Without doubt, the Nazi propaganda machine was being stretched to the full by the events in Western Europe and Russia. However, the Japanese government was even more determined that the people of Japan should believe that their brave imperial warriors were victorious in every campaign of the Pacific Offensive. There were, of course, plenty of occasions when they did score direct hits against the Allies, particularly out at sea. On the 19th of November, the Japanese Navy sunk the USS Sculpin, a Sago-class submarine. Appropriately named after a remarkably stealthy fish that can survive out of water as well as in it, and capable of inflicting a painful sting, the sinking of the Sculpin was a major blow to the American Navy. Yet the Japanese missed a golden opportunity to gain intelligence regarding the devastating attack the Allies were planning for the very next day on the 3 atolls in the Gilbert Islands, Makin, Tarawa and Abomana. Aboard the Sculpin was Captain John P. Cromwell, who'd been fully briefed on the offensive to take the Gilbert Islands, codenamed Operation Galvanic. When the submarine was first struck, the vessel's commander surfaced to give his crew the chance of survival. but a direct hit to the conning tower meant that he, along with many of his men, were killed outright. Cromwell was not amongst them, but realised if he was taken prisoner by the Japanese, he might reveal the secret plans under torture. Bravely, he went down with the sinking submarine, rather than risk jeopardising the operation, and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honour for devotion to his country. To date, the Americans had been given little chance to go on the offensive with the Japanese, because after the shock of Pearl Harbor, they'd constantly been taking a defensive position. Interestingly, the Battle of Tarawa was only the second time they'd done this, the first being the Guadalcanal campaign, where their amphibious landing force had met little resistance. But things were about to change dramatically. Strategically, the Gilbert Islands were of vital importance as the Allies increased their operations from the mid-Pacific to the Philippines and prepared to advance on Japan. Taking the Mariana Islands from the Japanese would be crucial if the US Navy stood any chance of succeeding in this objective, but naturally, Imperial Japan was all too aware of this. Because the Marianas, including the all-important island of Guam, had become a major target, Japanese reinforcements had been drafted in, fortifications consolidated to make the entire area as secure as possible. The Americans knew that they would have to advance island group by island group, because before they could even reach the Marianas, they would need to wrestle the nearby Marshall Islands from Japanese control. But before they could do that, the enemy garrison on the Tarawa Atoll needed to be neutralized. By now, the Americans had enough experience of the Japanese to come prepared, and as Operation Galvanic began on the 20th of November, over 6,000 US troops landed on Macon. On paper, the occupying army, made up of 300 Japanese soldiers and 500 Korean labourers, should have been easily defeated. But the battle was bitterly contested, and American casualties were high. It was a costly operation in other respects too, as the US escort carrier Liscombe Bay was torpedoed, killing 644 of the 900 crew. Then an accident aboard the US battleship Mississippi during the pre-landing bombardment of Macon, when the turret exploded, resulted in a further 43 American deaths. The people of Macon were nevertheless delighted to greet their US liberators, offering coconuts as a token of their gratitude. It was an experience the Allies were going to encounter many times in the coming months, as the freedom they were fighting so hard for was returned to those so long oppressed by the Axis of evil. With Macon secure, American troops began their assault on Tarawa Atoll. Again, about 6,000 of them, but there were 5,000 Japanese soldiers laying in wait for them. A bloody battle ensued, lasting some 76 hours, with more than 1,000 of the Americans killed, and the Japanese statistics certainly make for some fascinating reading. Of the vast defending force, only 1 Japanese officer and 16 of his men survived, alongside 129 of the conscripted Korean labourers who had also made up the numbers. For the American people, who had so far been protected by heavy censorship, the now unrestricted news reports were hugely shocking. Many condemned Washington for allowing the offensive to go ahead after seeing photographs of America's brave young men floating dead in the water. The realization that the Japanese were going to put up a long and terrible fight really did hit home. With their experiences on Macon and Tarawa, the Americans changed their tactics when they reached Abamana. Despite the much smaller Japanese garrison, one Marine was killed within minutes during an attempted landing. So it was decided to settle for using Navy gunfire only to clear the army of occupation. It was certainly effective, but not in terms of direct hits. Because of the 25 Japanese defenders, only 14 had been killed by gunfire. The rest had committed suicide. The loss of the Gilbert Islands to the Americans was far from being good news for the Japanese government back in Tokyo. But they did have the satisfaction of knowing the victorious US troops had suffered significant casualties in achieving their goal. The bad news was not yet over for the Japanese, as on the 25th of November, American bombers attacked a crucial airbase on Formosa, or as we know it today, Taiwan. The Japanese Navy operated heavily out of Formosa, which had been snatched from the Chinese, and the Americans, destroying 42 of their aircraft in this mission, was a huge blow. Air cover afforded the Japanese battleships extra protection, and to lose so many planes was very costly indeed. And it wasn't only the Americans giving the Japanese problems late in 1943, as on the same day in New Guinea, Australian forces captured vital territory. Suddenly, despite their fierce fighting and to-the-death attitude, the Japanese were not looking quite as invincible as they had liked to appear. Meanwhile, as the final days of November dawned, the pressure on Adolf Hitler in the West was increasing. On the 22nd, the British carried out a night raid on the German capital, dispatching 764 bombers to attack Berlin. With direct hits on the government section of the city, including the Admiralty and Air Ministry, Hitler was incensed. He was safely resting at his Wolf's Lair military headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia, while even the Chancellery and his train in a Berlin railway siding suffered heavy damage. The civilians of Berlin were not as fortunate as their leader, however, as 100 of them were crushed simply trying to get to safety in an underground shelter. Just as it had been for the civilians of London in the Blitz, the number of innocent casualties escalated, with 1,737 Berliners killed. Goebbels once again committed his personal feelings to his diary, noting that hell itself seems to have broken loose over us. The British lost 167 aircrew in the raid, but the very next night, Air Command ordered a further raid on Berlin. This time, 127 aircrew were lost, but the effect on the German capital was again devastating. With no heat, no light and no water, and fellow Berliners dying all around, there was little even Goebbels could do to improve the morale of the German people. For the Allies, there was work to be done wherever they turned, and in Italy, the push towards Rome continued. On the 20th of November, the British 8th Army crossed the Sangro River for the first time, while Kesselring was appointed Commander-in-Chief of all German forces in Italy, as Rommel's services were now in great demand, organising the defence of the Atlantic Wall. There were many major offensives like the bombing of Berlin and the continuing Italian campaign, but the little events were beginning to play a huge part too. In France, the resistance was undermining the German occupation at every turn, and with help from British agents, the preparations for the long-awaited invasion of the coast of northern France were, piece by piece, being slotted into place. Pulling all of the various elements of the Allied push for victory together was far from being an easy task. Meetings between the Allied leaders were incredibly difficult to orchestrate. A prime example of this was the Cairo Conference, held between the 22nd and the 26th of November. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, and America's President Roosevelt met with China's Chiang Kai-shek to discuss the Allied position against the Japanese. Russia's Joseph Stalin refused to attend, as he believed, with the Chinese present, it would be viewed by the Japanese as provocation on the part of the Soviets. On the 27th of November, the Cairo Declaration was nevertheless signed by the three leaders present, stating that the Allies would continue to employ military force until Japan's unconditional surrender. It was also decided that when that happened, all the islands of the Pacific seized by the Japanese since the First World War would be taken back. All territories Japan had seized from China would also be restored, and last, but by no means least, Korea would become independent. With the Cairo Conference complete, Churchill and Roosevelt looked towards further discussions on the Allies' plans to invade France. While Stalin's absence from Cairo had been manageable, it was time for the Big Three, as they were so often dubbed, to meet as the Tehran Conference began. Stalin had not travelled outside Russia since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. But the three unlikely allies arrived in Tehran amid the tightest security to agree the plan for an Anglo-American cross-channel invasion planned for spring or summer 1944. In the discussions on the 29th of November, Churchill outlined to Stalin the conditions that needed to be met if Operation Overlord had any chance of succeeding. Firstly, there had to be a satisfactory reduction in the German fighter forces in northwest Europe. Secondly, German reserves in France and the Low Countries had to be minimised on the day of the assault. And thirdly, the Allies had to make sure the Germans could not transfer significant reinforcements from other points for the first 60 days of the operation. Stalin was sceptical as to whether this was possible, but Churchill, as ever, found the right words to express what was required when he said, "It will be our stern duty to hurl across the Channel against the Germans every sinew of our strength." But amidst discussions outlining the plans for Operation Overlord, Stalin also had quite an agenda of his own. He made it clear that the moment Germany was defeated, the Soviets would embark upon a war with the Japanese. Churchill described Stalin's declaration as a momentous decision that had to be kept absolutely top secret. In fact, it wasn't even noted in the secret records of the Tehran talks. There were also other matters on the table for discussion, but one in particular was ironically kept top secret from the Russians. Roosevelt and Churchill chose not to disclose to Stalin that scientists in America working on the atomic bomb were making massive progress, and that B-29 bombers were now being modified to carry and drop the deadly devices. The fear of new weaponry and scientific advances was huge for the Allies and the Axis alike, and in Britain, concern over Hitler's designs for his unmanned rocket bombs continued to increase. Although it would still be many months before his V-1 rockets would be operational, a rare visit by Hitler to a flying bomb test site was scrutinised in the minutest detail. Hitler at this time was always reluctant to leave his Wolf's Lair HQ due to growing fears that he'd be assassinated, as his health, both mentally and physically, deteriorated. It has been suggested that he was suffering from Parkinson's disease, but this has never been substantiated. In the light of this, British intelligence knew that such a visit must have been important, and it was even speculated that the rocket bombs could weigh up to 7 tons. Consequently, Churchill's government put in place plans to make millions of hospital beds available for those who might be injured by such a weapon. Prevention would nevertheless be better than a cure, so Operation Crossbow was also instigated to systematically bomb any site in northern France that looked suspicious from reconnaissance photographs. With the arrival of December, as the world waited for the end of another year at war, the major players continued to manoeuvre themselves into position. On the 7th of December, the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed General Dwight D. Eisenhower to the much-coveted command of Operation Overlord. Interestingly, Eisenhower had not seen active service, but in his long and distinguished US military career, he'd proved himself to be a natural organiser and leader of men. Calm and level-headed, with Eisenhower as supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, Overlord was in a very safe pair of hands indeed. And Eisenhower was not alone. The British General, Bernard Montgomery, was also about to be called to rally for the Overlord cause. He'd been fully occupied in Italy since his rise to prominence with the British Eighth Army in North Africa. But things were moving very slowly now in the Italian campaign as the Germans tightened their grip on Rome and other significant strongholds. By the end of December, Montgomery returned to England to command the 21st Army Group, while Oliver Leese took over Monty's role in Italy. Always outspoken, Montgomery, with a characteristic lack of tact, announced that he was glad to be leaving what he described as the dog's breakfast of the Allied campaign in Italy. Ironically, there were dissenting voices, most notably from the American camp, claiming that Monty had actually played a part in creating the dog's breakfast, and things did not exactly bode well for future relations between the opinionated Englishman and certain US generals. By the very nature of the Anglo-American offensive, these strong-minded personalities were going to have to forget their differences and work together, and it would take all of Eisenhower's immense talent as a diplomat to ensure the very men needed to win the war did not end up fighting amongst themselves. Even so, as more and more attention was now being focused on Overlord, the Allies still continued to push on towards Rome. For the Canadian, British and American troops fighting in Italy, it was now evident that the battles ahead were going to be long, drawn out and costly. What had appeared to be a straightforward campaign was now going to become a war of attrition throughout 1944. The Germans at the front of Cassino, as 1943 drew to a close, could not be dislodged, despite the best efforts of the Allies. The winter weather was making the task even more difficult, and any hope of matters in Italy being completely concluded before Operation Overlord commenced were fading fast. As Christmas appeared on the horizon, events in the Pacific also continued to hit the headlines. On the 15th of December, American troops landed on the Arawa Peninsula at the western end of New Britain in the Solomon Islands. It was a strategically important advance, with the capital of New Britain, Rabaul, still operating as a formidable Japanese stronghold. With people everywhere praying for peace at Christmas time, World War II relentlessly marched ever onwards. On Christmas Eve, the British once again bombed Berlin, and on Christmas Day, American planes knocked out 24 of the flying bomb sites that had been spotted in northern France. In Washington, President Roosevelt made his traditional broadcast to the nation.
We know now that if we lose this war, it will be generations or even centuries before our conception of democracy can live again.
There was little comfort to be had from his wise words, which was totally appropriate after the recent events in the Pacific and the horrific casualties inflicted upon the Americans by the Japanese. For the sake of those US Marines and their families, the bitter pill could have no sugarcoating. Roosevelt pulled America together with a timely warning of what the year ahead was likely to bring, asking for one and all to find the strength and fortitude that would be required if the Allies were going to be victorious. He said, "The war is now reaching the stage when we shall have to look forward to large casualty lists, dead, wounded, and missing." War entails just that. There is no easy road to victory, and the end is not yet in sight. It was evidently just what was required of the American president, as a day later, US troops launched Operation Backhander, a landing on Cape Gloucester, the extreme tip of New Britain. There was no festive holiday out in the Pacific, but within a week, the Americans had secured a vital airfield, giving them the perfect location to launch attacks on the yet unconquered half of New Guinea. This was a positive note for the year to end on for the Allies, but the Japanese fought back as fiercely as ever, and there was little doubt that the first months of 1944 would come complete with ever more conflict for the world at war. The grand conferences had been attended. The now famous Allied leaders had been pictured chatting together at Cairo and Tehran, and despite the major policy rift on human rights that existed between the Western Allies and the Russians, for the time being at least, they were presenting a united front. What would happen to the strained allegiances once the war was over was going to be extremely complicated, and on a global scale, the ramifications were immense. Yet from the sleepy seaside towns of southern England through to the ancient streets of historic London, it was this determined island nation that was about to take centre stage. For Adolf Hitler, his earlier inability to break the people's spirit and invade Britain would return to haunt him, as Operation Overlord now had the most stable of platforms to be launched from. The people of Britain would once more be asked to stand firm and resolute, playing host to the many thousands of Allied troops and supplies required to cross the Channel and invade France. Preparations were now almost complete to force the German army of occupation to retreat back across its own borders in a prelude to Hitler's last stand. The blueprint for victory was at long last about to be written.